Today, I'm going to talk about the kind of decisions people make while they're online. So I've been studying these kind of decisions for the last 5 or 6 years in different contexts, and two in particular: decisions relating to the results people get when they're searching the web, and decisions people make with online recipes. So that is, what food are they going to eat, or what food are they going to share with others? It wasn't at all clear to me when I started researching these, but the more I've learned about how these decisions are made, the more I realized that there are similarities between the two. So today, given the conference's theme of information discovery, improving user experience, quality and trust, I'm going to focus on the one on the left-hand side, search results. But towards the end of the talk, I will explain with some examples how these processes relate. So in this talk, I'm going to make 3 primary claims. The first one is that online decisions are biased in lots of different ways. The second one is that the biases are context dependent. That means the biases in play change depending on the circumstance. And the third one that I'm going to make is that if you can understand the biases in play, then you can avoid them or perhaps even exploit them to promote desired behaviors, so behaviors that users themselves want to exhibit. So let's zoom in on the search results context. Why would we want to study biases in this situation? So we know that search is deeply ingrained in just about every aspect of people's lives, and it influences everything from the products they buy to their views on different topics to how they react to medical symptoms. And there's evidence that people, especially those with little knowledge or no strong opinion on a topic, will end up thinking exactly what they find. And perhaps the most worrying aspect of this is that most users are unaware of this. It turns out that search can be biased in lots of different ways. So some viewpoints are more prominent or more highly ranked than others. Different groups of people may be ranked higher than others. And even within a particular topic, different subtopics may be more or less prominent in the research, in the search rankings. And to compound this, the way that people interact with search results is also biased. So we prefer the higher ranked documents. We tend to accept the viewpoint that's most prominent on the search results. The way that we evaluate search results is not independent. There's anchoring going on, and we tend to look for information that confirms our own beliefs. So that's so-called confirmation bias. And in the first study I want to present, my colleague Marcus Kattenbeck and I investigated how this confirmation bias idea affects the decisions people make with respect to judging how credible information is in search results. So we performed a study where 105 participants were asked to judge the credibility of search results for 3 controversial topics: the healthiness of a vegan diet, the safety of autonomous vehicles, and whether or not cannabis should be legalized. So these are controversial in the sense that you can legitimately argue either in favor or against each, but at the same time, you can find both credible and non-credible information for each position. And we hypothesized that people in favor of a topic would rate information with the opposing view as less credible and vice versa. So for each of these topics, participants rated 8 search results presented in a random order. Half of the results were in favor and the other half were against. And each of these, well, half of each of these were either deemed credible or non-credible. So high quality sources and less high quality sources. What we found was not what we expected to find, nor, if we're being honest, what we would want to find. So this is the output here of one topic, the vegan diet topic, but the trend was very similar regardless of the topic. So these white boxes here are the high quality search results, or the judgments for the high search quality results. And here are the judgments for the lower quality results. So what we ideally would want is that the white ones to be up here and the black ones to be down here, but that's not what we got. We also found no evidence for confirmation bias. So the blue and the pink dots, they represent the stances pre-task of the different participants. And if there was a confirmation bias effect going on, you would expect to see the blue dots clustering together and the pink dots clustering together. And what you see is that they're scattered all over the place regardless. So it seems that people were trying really hard to judge the credibility of the results as objectively as possible. But what's also clear is that they're simply not very good at this. The participants were neither accurate nor reliable. So the question is, why is this? How are people making these decisions? And why is it leading to unreliable and inaccurate credibility judgments? So to find out, we reran the study, but rather than simply collecting judgments, we performed a think aloud protocol whereby participants explained their thinking behind the judgments. We recorded the audio, transcribed it, and analyzed the data qualitatively. And the qualitative insights do go a long way to explaining the process people go through when they're making credibility judgments and why this led to the outcomes we saw earlier. So it turns out that when they're making credibility judgments, people extract cues that push their judgments or bias their judgments in a particular direction. I won't go into details here, but we identified 10 different cues that bias decisions in a particular direction. So the domain was an important one, so was the rubric, the language used, temporal information, and people also tried to extract things or people or companies that could be viewed as an authority figure. And what was happening was that different people were extracting different cues and their judgments were being biased accordingly. And it turned out that even if people were extracting or using the same cues, they were interpreting these cues very differently. So without going through all the types of cues that we discovered, I wanted to give you a feel for how the cues that bias decisions themselves are contextually biased. So to illustrate this, I'll show you some examples with one particular cue, domain, and explain how credibility judgments can be affected. So let's take the example where participants recognized or were familiar with the domain of a result, and that this led to a positive example. So S said, that is the Süddeutsche Zeitung. Listings relating to the Süddeutsche will always have a credibility bonus for me. FAS. Now we have the FAS again. That page is okay. I know it. NTV. NTV is basically trustworthy. So basically in all three of these cases here, there was a familiarity with the domain, and that was viewed positively, and that skewed the credibility judgments accordingly. However, as the following examples show, the way a domain is perceived can vary significantly across users. So participant 114 said, and then you have the classical Welt.de. That's exactly like FAS or well-known, so positive. Participant 112, so Welt.de. As far as I know, that belongs to Bild-Zeitung, which is a tabloid newspaper in Germany. So I would view that as rather non-credible. Or participant 115, yeah, the Orientation Die Welt, it's a rather conservative newspaper, and therefore the view in veganism, that's a bit problematic. So as we've just seen, different people view the same source differently. And the last example hints that this might vary over topics. So we've got two more examples that demonstrate that the domain is perceived, the way the domain is perceived can be very context sensitive. So here we have two comments about the site cast, or a search result from cast.net, one from participant 112 and one from 113. Then cast.net, I find, well, it's a Catholic site. I know that coincidentally, that it's a larger site for Catholics. I would click on that because I assume that it has to do with ethical discussions and questions. And similarly, participant 113, because of ethics, because I think about this, if I think about this topic and I want to get to grips with autonomous vehicles, then ethics would be a question that I would want to consider. So for this domain, but not particularly other domains, this was viewed as a credible source. Even highly rated domains can be downweighted under certain circumstances, as this example shows. Better skin, better figure, better mood. That seems as if only positive things are described and absolutely nothing negative or any comparison is drawn. It seems that only positive aspects are mentioned and not the disadvantages or consequences that these can have. Not everyone who's vegan nourishes himself appropriately, and that can have consequences for their health. So the fact that Süddeutsche, which is a broadsheet newspaper in Germany, presented what the participant perceived to be an imbalanced perspective led to that participant giving a lower credibility judgment. So the key points from that first study was that credibility judgments are biased by lots of different factors, and that the biases vary across users and situations. So let's look at a second study. This was work done by two master students of mine, Markus Bink and Sebastian Schwarz, together with Tim Draves from Delft. And what we studied was the effects that biasing featured snippets can have when people are searching to form an opinion, another kind of online decision. And what we wanted to determine was whether the stance and the logic of argumentation, so that's a term from communication sciences that means basically the way of describing how an argument is made, and whether that affects what participants believe post-search and the way that they make their argument. So this is an example of a search results page that participants interacted with in our study. It consisted of a featured snippet followed by 9 standard results. You can't see them on the page. They would have to scroll or have a bigger screen. And what we did was we manipulated the stance, so whether the featured snippet was for or against a topic, and then they did the same with the standard results. So if the featured snippet was in favor, then the next result would be against, and then the next one would be in favor and against, and so on and so forth. And if the featured snippet was against, the next one would be in favor, and so on and so forth. We also manipulated the logic of argumentation used in the featured snippet, and made sure that in the remainder of the standard results, there was a mix of logics in play. So it was a between groups design, so participants only got to see one of these, but these were the different experimental conditions. So we had 3 different topics: intellectual property rights, school uniforms, and obesity, where you can take various positions in favor and against. We had for each topic 2 SERPs, 4 SERPs, sorry, 2 in favor and 2 against, and each of them had different logics of argumentation. So this was the procedure that we went through. So first of all, we had a pre-study questionnaire because we wanted to filter out people with strong views. We were only interested in people who had mild views or hadn't made up their mind. Then we had a pre-task questionnaire, which where we asked people to outline any arguments they could have in favor or against. Then they interacted with the SERP, and they could do this as freely as long as they wanted and interact with many search results as they wanted. And then we did the same thing after. So we took their position after searching and recorded any justifications that they had. And a post-study questionnaire took in demographic information and so on and so forth. So we recruited 256 participants for the study, but after we filtered out those with strong views, only 182 took part. So what were the outcomes? Well, you need to read the details for read the paper for the detailed analysis, but these graphics give you a strong intuition for what happened. So the bottom 2 diagrams show the distribution of pre and post-task stances for featured snippets with a moral logic that were against the presented topics. So in this case, intellectual property rights and school uniforms. What do we see here? So before task, because we filtered out the rest, participants had a neutral stance, but there was a slight balance towards being in favor of these topics. But you can see after searching, this changed considerably. Some people, despite the negative featured snippet, did end up having a positive outcome, but the stance in general tilted towards the negative. Similarly, if you look at the spread of logics made, so the kind of arguments that were being proposed before interacting with the SERP, there was a good spread, but afterwards, people overwhelmingly took the line of argumentation in the featured snippet. Key points. What we've seen, decisions relating to web search are influenced by several factors, call these biases, including presentation. So in the case of the featured snippets, we see that the biases vary across users and across situations. So how can we make, or how can we help people make better decisions? So just like Ian in his first talk, is that we always have an eye on how we can change systems based on what we learn about how people behave. So the first thing we can do is do a good job on featured snippets. So if there is a correct answer, then we should show that correct answer in the featured snippet. If there's not, as in the case of these debated topics, then we need to make sure that the featured snippet is balanced, because the featured snippet overwhelmingly biases outcomes. A second thing that we can do is provide information to control the biases in play. So we can design SERPs such that they nudge participants to use the cues that will lead them to decisions that reflect the ground truth. And this could be either the credibility of a web page or the search outcome. So this is a relatively old example from Schwartz and Morris. What they showed is that if you give people extra information about the page in the result listing, such as page rank for a page or how experts or other users rate the page, they provide judgment much closer to the ground truth. A similar example by Yamamoto and Tanaka showed that a similar type of augmentation of the search listings can have a similar outcome. A caveat, however, is we haven't been able to recreate these effects, and that hasn't been for a lack of trying. So I have a class that I run every year where students in groups run small studies, and this has been a topic of interest to them, and they've tried lots of different things from credibility scores based on nutrition labeling to star ratings to graphics such as or similar to the spider graphic, and none of them has been able to replicate the kind of effects in the literature. So then let's look at a different approach. Rather than using nudges, we can use so-called boosts. So this is a competing framework from psychology that provides users with competences that influence their behavior in a desired manner. The advantages here, well, there's a couple. The first one is that they're permanent. So if you take a nudge away, then you remove the effect. However, you provide someone with a competence, they don't lose it, at least not straight away. And there are also ethical benefits because there's less in the way of manipulation going on. The process is much more transparent. So in this work, together with a former student of mine, Anna-Marie Ortlov, Steve Zimmerman, and Niels Hensey, we looked at how we can provide competences that influence the web pages people interact with. So in his PhD, Steve tested this idea with info boxes. So he augmented search engine result pages with this kind of information here to try and help understand or to give people information and competences that will help them understand which kind of web pages would lead to third parties sharing their data. Anna-Marie wanted to go further than this to see if whether the approach would still work in a web browsing scenario. And to do this, she built a Firefox extension to provide either boosts, such as the one on the left, that give people tips and hints at how they might avoid cookies, or nudges, like the one on the right, where their behavior in terms of the cookies that were recorded was compared to other users taking part in the study. And to test this idea, she performed a pretty large-scale naturalistic study. So 68 people used this plugin for their web browsing over a period of 3 weeks. And she discovered that both nudges and boosts helped improve browsing privacy. She also discovered that boosts had the extra advantage that they improved user knowledge about privacy, at least in the short term, but the benefit weakened over time. So decisions with search results are biased. These biases are context dependent, and we can improve decisions via nudges and via boosts. So I mentioned right at the start that there are large similarities between the decision-making processes with search results and online recipe contexts, and I'd like to use the remaining time to try and point these out. So I've been working on online recipes for a good while now, and my colleagues and I have been studying naturalistic behavioral log data from online recipe portals to try and understand patterns in recipe ratings, which we see as a proxy for food choice. So again, we found lots of different biases in play. So first of all, there's a huge bias towards unhealthy recipes, to such an extent actually that you can use bookmarked recipes to make a good prediction about the obesity level in the geographic area that the user resides. There are also strong temporal patterns, so you can see that people interact with very different types of recipes depending on the type of year. There are strong gender differences, so men and women upload very different types of food, and for different reasons. People with different hobbies tend to like different food. And there are very strong geographical trends. So even within a country, but also across countries, you can see very different food trends or patterns. And to complement these naturalistic data, we started performing experiments whereby participants had to choose between a pair of very similar recipes. So this example here shows honey baked chicken 1 against easiest oven baked chicken. And the way we generated these pairs varied. So we've done lots of these experiments, and we chose the recipe pairs such that they vary in terms of particular properties such as fat content or calories. And we also vary the information we show. So in some experiments, we show just the recipe title and the picture. Other times we give information about the ingredients and the quantities of ingredients. And I just wanted to summarize some of the main takeaways. Oh yeah, so we've also asked different questions. So which one they find the most appealing, which one they think contains the most fat, etc. So here are the main takeaways that we can take from all these experiments that we've run. So it turns out that people are really poor at judging which recipe contains the most fat. So they're not significantly better than random. However, if you ask people which one they find most appealing, it turns out that they pick out the fattiest one on average. So this time significantly better than random. And just as we did with the credibility judgments, we asked participants to explain their processes. And it turns out that the process that they go through is very similar to how they judge credibility. So people are looking for cues that indicate fat or lack of fat, and they make their judgments based on this. So sometimes they pick out something in an image, sometimes they pick out an ingredient, and depending on their level of knowledge, the way that they interpret these cues can be very different. And so all this varies over participants. So again, this process is very, very similar to what we saw at the start of the talk. So we can nudge credibility judgments, but can we nudge the choices people make when they're eating food? It turns out that the answer is yes. So we discovered that we could build a classifier that would predict choices people made using only low-level visual properties as input parameters. So things like the sharpness of the image, the brightness of the image, how colorful it is, contrast, and so on and so forth. And we ran experiments where we used the prediction from the classifier in the process of creating the recipe pairs that people had to choose from. So we had pairs where the recipes were similar, but one had more fat than the other, and the one with the least fat was predicted by the algorithm to be more attractive. And by doing that, we reversed the trend such that people chose the recipe with the least fat on average. So to give you a feeling for how this works, so I can't see the audience, so I can't have any feedback, but these are two examples of similar images, and I'll tell you that the classifier predicted the first one, which was not surprising to me. This one here, the classifier predicts the second one. Why anybody would post something like this on a recipe forum, I have no idea, but the classifier matches my input or my impression. And the third one is much more difficult, but the classifier thinks this one would be the most attractive. So, key points to round things up. Perception of fat and the attractiveness of food is developed, so the decisions people make is very similar to the way we interact and make decisions about search results. And by emphasizing some cues over others, we can impact the decisions people make. Tying up, and I think I'm just about on time. So the decisions we make online are biased in many ways. We've seen lots of examples. And we've seen that the decision-making processes are quite similar. And we've got lots of different ways of influencing decisions. We've seen examples of nudges and boosts, but we're still really early on in understanding how these kind of things can be built into information systems. So we still have lots to learn. So a big thank you to all of my co-authors on all of the papers that I mentioned. Thank you.